You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Health Podcast, and I have J. Scott Turner. He's an American physiologist who's contributed to the theory of collective intelligence through some field work in looking at South African species of a termite, Macrotermes mycoseni, and discovering things such as these termites and other species seem to act in concert as a superorganism, if I have it right, to create things like termite mounds that not only benefit the community in certain ways, but literally physically act as a bridge to the community to create a superorganism. So I'm probably butchering how he would describe it, but Scott, welcome. Thanks. How you doing?
Thanks. Glad to be here. Yeah. And you did a great job, by the way, describing it.
Oh, thank you. So tell me about, how did you get interest in this kind of work, and how did you first encounter what you considered to be a superorganism?
Well, with respect to the termites, I literally kind of stumbled upon the subject. As you said in your introduction, I'm a physiologist. That's someone who's interested in how living things work. And I'd always combined that with an interest in ecology and adaptation and evolution. And I came across these termites at the end of a multi-year stay in Cape Town in South Africa. And as a part of my stay there, I picked up a family, and when my contract ran out at the University of Cape Town, I had to do something to be able to make ends meet, and so I took a job at a small college up near the Botswana border. And one of the striking things about that landscape is the enormous number of these huge termite mounds that are around there. They're a very prominent feature of those savanna landscape. And I was faced with the challenge of trying to generate several laboratory exercises for the students that I was teaching up there. And I thought these termite mounds would provide a really interesting demonstration for the students. One of the reasons that I thought that is that there was a very well-established and beautiful story about how these termite mounds worked. They were called air-conditioned termite mounds, and the idea was that the colony, which is actually underneath the mound. The termites don't live in the mound; they live in a compact. They live in a compact nest underground. They're fascinating creatures. There are a couple of million individuals in this colony. They do things like cultivate fungus to help them digest their food as they bring it back. And they generate quite a bit of heat as a process of doing that. And they generate so much heat that it's actually similar to the rate of our own metabolism, our own heat production. And the story was that generation of heat would set up a circulation of air within the mound, similar to what happens when you have a space heater sitting in the middle of a cold room. You know, the space heater heats the air, it's buoyant, it rises up and circulates in the room. So I thought, well, here's an easy thing to demonstrate to my students and kind of a neat subject. And so I rigged up some simple instruments to demonstrate the airflow, and took the students out there to demonstrate to them what was going on. And to my embarrassment, it wasn't anything like the beautiful story said it should be, and so that was intriguing to me. That actually started a years long research project, not only to figure out uh, what was the way that these things actually worked if the accepted story wasn't true, and along the way, science, when you answer one question, it usually opens up a whole bunch of other questions, and that just laid out a whole series of threads that led me into all kinds of other topics, ranging from ecology to engineering, into some fairly philosophical issues about what's the nature of the organism and those kinds of things. And it's been a wonderful journey for me. It's been intellectually very stimulating. It's kept me busy for many years, trying to figure out these things, trying to come to terms with what they are and how they work, and that has led me into some thoughts about adaptation and evolution and the nature of the organism. But at the beginning, it was completely serendipitous. I literally stumbled onto the topic.
I thought you were going to say that you lived in a house and there was termites there, and one day you saw them, they had eaten away the wall and revealed, I don't know, this mound in a hidden part of the house. That'd be a cool story too, I guess.
Well, that is a cool story, and that's what often happens with North American termites. But these termites down there, they don't inhabit houses. They build their own, literally, and they're a very important part of the ecology of these savanna ecosystems. They consume enormous amounts of grass and wood, more so than the big mammals that people pay thousands of dollars to come down and take photographs of, and they're extremely important in the functioning of these ecosystems. So they're not pests at all. They are very important parts of these ecosystems, and they're also just fascinating creatures. And they make for what is sometimes a fairly eerie-looking landscape with all these great big termite mounds popping up out of the ground.
So I understand that termites live in a colony like ants or bees, and they're kind of they're a collective. But why would you go further and say that because of the mound itself, that's part of the superorganism? I can see saying the colony itself could be a superorganism and it has one goal, etc. But why the mound included?
Yeah, the whole superorganism idea is an interesting one. It's come and gone out of fashion with different trends in scientific thinking. But the basic idea is that the colony behaves in many ways like an organism does. In our cells, for example, we consist of many billions of cells, and there's specialization. Among them, they work together, and the end result is this coherent organism that we and every other organism is. But you find a lot of the same attributes in many of these assemblages of organisms, like bee colonies and ant colonies. And as I said, this has come and gone out of fashion. It was thought to be kind of a nebulous philosophical concept for many years, but then it's recently come back as something real, as we have thought about the nature of the organism. Now, the fascinating thing about the mound is that the mound is not just this big pile of dirt. It has complex architecture. It's differentiated in structure from the nest underground where the termites actually live, and the colony, or sorry, I beg your pardon, the mound itself has a function. It serves basically to capture wind energy in the environment, and that helps power the gas exchange needs of the termite colony that's located underground. So it's literally a lung made from soil, and it's a wind-driven lung as well. And what we have found is that we've tried to delve into just how it works, is that the mechanism of that dirt lung is very similar to the mechanisms that govern the operation of our own lungs. And so this complex function is based upon a complex structure, complex architecture, And the question for a physiologist like me is that, this is a physiological organ that's been generated de novo, literally out of soil, and it's a kind of emergent physiology, if you will. That's not parts of the organism itself. That is the individual termites that make up the colony. And this is a fundamental question for physiologists. Where does physiology come from? And in this case, the physiology, that is the gas exchange, comes from these termites collectively building this structure that has complex structure and complex function in it as well. And so it stands out. Well, you can kind of get the idea why this has occupied my energies and time for many, many years to work all this out, and the questions that it poses for where physiology comes from.
Yeah. So so are there a lot of examples of external creations by a living creature that are so integrated with their ability to live that it essentially is an extension of themselves as an organism?
Well, yeah, this is one of the things that came out of this work, and I don't want to say that I'm the only person who's done this. One of the original scientists who started to ponder what the meaning of animal-built structures was a German biologist. He won the Nobel Prize, Karl von Frisch, and he wrote a very famous book called Animal Architecture. And his thesis there was that lots of organisms build things, and what do those built things tell us about the organism? And his basic idea was that animal architecture is a kind of roadmap of the behavior that led to it, and that's been one stream of thought that has permeated this whole issue of things built by animals. Where I have come in, and my little piece of the puzzle there is that animal architecture is not so much frozen behavior as it is an expression of the physiological needs of the organism. And the more you look for these kinds of modified environments, the more you find them. Once you have the search image to look for these things, and you see that modification of the environment and building of things by animals, not just animals, but also plants and bacteria and those sorts of creatures. It's ubiquitous. The termite mound is a spectacular example of it, but the termite mound is really a means of adapting an environment to the physiological needs of the organisms that inhabit it. And you see this emerging as a general property of living things. Living things adapt not necessarily by being genetically endowed to function well in a particular environment, but they actually modify the environment to themselves. In other words, adaptation in this instance is a two-way street. Animals and organisms adapt to environments, but they also adapt environments to themselves. And as I said, the more you look for these kinds of things, the more you see them almost everywhere that life exists.
Well, what about in people? They have gut bacteria and other bacteria, and they outnumber us in terms of number of cells, and certainly in terms of number of genes. How about at that level? It's probably easier to say that them and us are a superorganism.
Absolutely, and that's the emerging idea behind these amazing discoveries of the flora that share our bodies. And I remember when I was an undergraduate biology student many, many years ago, we were taught about the gut bacterium, which was E. coli, and since then, the knowledge of those flora has just exploded, as you know, and when you look at the role of the gut flora, for example, they do the same thing. They interact with the cells that are us, in quotes. The cells that are descended from the fertilized egg that gave rise to us, and they construct their environments as well, to the point where if you try to raise animals mammals without the gut bacteria, then their function of their gut is just in the tank. It doesn't develop properly, and it doesn't function well as a consequence. And an important part of the ability of our own guts to function well depends not only on the presence of these bacteria, but also on the ability of these bacteria to modify the gut environment themselves. And so there's a very fascinating mutual relationship between what goes on in our guts and also the flora that live on our skins and other kinds of places in the body, and the healthy functioning of those things. It's literally a big cooperative endeavor, and you have not only us, in quotes, adapting to the bacteria, but the bacteria adapting us to them.
Yeah, it's weird when you think about it. Like in humans, we have all these different bacteria and viruses and fungi, et cetera, and none of them are wanting to die. They all want to proliferate and do their own thing and advance their own strain. But then again, they're all cooperating to the benefit of this one superorganism, which is us.
Exactly.
It's just odd that you wonder what does a liver cell know and how does it act versus a bacteria in our guts. How different are they and how they operate and what they will and won't do. It's just, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's just strange, this hierarchy of allegiance to the one.
Oh, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and the common thread in all this, and you touched upon this. How does a liver cell know what to do and what it is, and that's really the fundamental core of it. The liver cell does know. We don't have to surround that word in scare quotes. There is a certain ability of every cell to assess the environment that it's in and to modify not only what's inside its cell boundaries, but also to modify what's outside the cell boundaries as well. And as part of that mix is all the other cognitive individuals that are in that system, and so one of the cells lining our intestines, for example, it kind of knows what it wants to be. It develops in a certain way, and it works to make itself that certain way. But then along come these bacteria who have a different cognitive view of the world, and if they don't come to an agreement, the whole system dies. And so there is this fundamental element of cooperation that has to take place for that whole assemblage to persist through time. And at the heart of it is this ongoing negotiation between the different actors there. And of course, you can proliferate those negotiations almost ad infinitum. The intestinal cell interacts with other cells, and there are immune cells that come into the mix and have their own particular cognitive appreciation of the world around them. Never mind the bacteria and the interaction with all the other different competing species of bacteria. And somehow they have to come to some kind of mutual accommodation, or the whole thing blows up to the detriment of all. It is mind-boggling to imagine the complexity of it and what has to be going on there.
What do you think cancer is? It seems to have all the hallmarks of an independent life form, except for the mistake it makes in killing its host, which kills it. But is that a break from allegiance to the one, to the superorganism, and that's what, I don't know, the model that cancer operates under? It just makes me think. I don't know.
Well, cancer is a particularly interesting case. The standard model is that you have this renegade tribe of cells that develops either through a mutation or some other modification, and it becomes independent from the collective of the organism. Especially in the case of breast cancer, though, there are some surprising things that are going on there. So for example, when you look at the ability of breast cancer cells to travel to other cells in the body, so-called metastatic breast cancer, which of course is very serious and very damaging to the body. It's not so much you have this renegade set of cells, as you have cells within the body, particularly parts of the immune system, that actually facilitate their transmission to other parts of the body. So there's a level of cooperation and mutual accommodation that takes place even there, and we're still trying to work out what the implications of that are for not only how to treat metastatic breast cancer, but also just what is the meaning of cancer. What is it? What's going on there? And is it a failure of regulation, or is it another regulatory agenda that has risen in some pernicious ways within the body? And so, we're even going through some changes in our thinking about that, but this all does come back to what's the nature of the organism. Is it this very highly regulated kind of system? Is that where the stability comes from, or is there something deeper going on? Is it the consequence of this incredibly complex set of cognitive interactions of individual actors like cells or assemblages of cells with other cells, and what kinds of negotiations and mutual accommodations come up there, and this tendency of our own immune cells to help spread breast cancer cells to other organs of the body. What's going on there? I mean, it's not that the immune cells are being prevented from doing their job. They're doing their job perfectly well, but they're aiding the propagation of this pernicious lineage of cells that has developed within a woman's body.
Yeah, it's weird. It seems to mimic human society. There's people in human society, like let's say the military, and they will give their life for the common good. Then there's maybe, let's say, police that are supposed to do that, but at times they may be corrupted. Then there's individuals that are just community minded. Then there's rogue individuals that say, to heck with everyone else, I'm doing my thing. And I wonder if all those things are evidenced in a living organism, or us.
That seems to be the emerging story.
So, do we have names for these different levels of allegiance, let's say, or hierarchy?
Not really, actually. It's an interesting question. I'm not aware of anyone who has tried to put together a classification of these different kinds of behaviors, in part because I think our understanding or our conception of the organism is changing quite rapidly. It's changing not only from people who are interested in the evolution and evolutionary implications of this and adaptation, but I think it's also changing a great deal based upon developing knowledge of the nature of the gene, and so, for example, the gene has classically been thought of as a specifier of function, and that can be a very profitable way of thinking about it. This is one of the reasons why, coming back to cancer, why cancer therapy, the appropriate therapy, turns so strongly on particular mutations that might exist in a person's body, and the treatment of a cancer is going to be influenced very strongly by whether those mutations exist or not. But the emerging conception of what the genome is, that is, the assemblage of DNA molecules that make up all the supposed genes, in the body is really going through a tremendous amount of flux. So, for example, in the specifier concept of genes, the classical idea was that you have a code in DNA that specifies a particular protein, for example, and that protein has a certain function, and the cell or organism will function better or worse depending upon what that sequence code is in the DNA. What seems to be emerging right now is a much more dynamic conception of the interaction between DNA and the rest of the cell that actually introduces quite a bit of fluidity in the ways that a sequence of DNA, for example, DNA nucleotides, will translate into function, and furthermore, the feedback of that function onto the very definition of a gene, and this can take place in terms of immediate feedbacks in living cells, for example, or within living organisms, but it can also feed back to the extent that these variations are heritable, so they can be transmitted onto subsequent generations, and so what this is pointing to is a very dynamic and fluid relationship between hereditary memory, which could be part of genes, but could also be parts of built environments by organisms, and function. And so it's we're really living through a time when a lot of supposedly well-established dogmas about biology and genes and evolution are really up in the air again in ways that they haven't been for many years.
Yeah, it makes Darwinian evolution, the modern synthesis and all that, look pretty lame and missing out on so many different things that are right in front of us. It puts everything into the world of randomness and no thought, and it's just ridiculous the more I learn.
Well, it is heretical for you to say that, and it's heretical for anyone who takes that position to say that. And of course, this is one of the interesting things about being a scientist right now, being an evolutionary scientist, is that there's a lot of heresy floating about, and the heresy is starting to look more credible every day as we understand more and more about the way the whole thing works. And I don't want to take anything away from the neo-Darwinian revolution, because if you look back at the history of the development of this, the emergence of neo-Darwinism was literally one of the great intellectual achievements of all time. So I don't want to take anything away from it, but it was built upon some conceptions of the gene and hereditary memory that just aren't really applicable anymore, and I think you characterize it correctly. We're looking at an explanation for evolution that is looking increasingly tattered and not very powerful in terms of being able to explain what it purports to explain. But again, I don't want to take anything away from the brilliant achievement that it was. It's just that we've kind of moved on. And there's a lot more interesting there that it cannot explain.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about during pregnancy, so your immune system tries to identify self versus non-self and attack non-self. And it's funny, during pregnancy, there's this, period of cooperation because the new baby is essentially non-self from the mother. So it's amazing that cooperation goes on, and then, a temporary armistice, I guess you can call it, that's facilitated by the placenta and other things. And then business as usual continues,
Yeah, I think it goes even further than that. When you look at the some of the theories about the origins of immune diseases and autoimmune diseases, things like asthma and those kinds of things, the key picture of the immune system that's emerging is it is a trainable system that operates on being able to sense environments and being able to respond accordingly to them. And so, for example, you're no doubt aware of I think it's the hygiene hypothesis for the origin of asthma. And the kids go out and they play in the dirt and they the things in our mouths and these kinds of things. And what that's doing is actually training the immune system to this kind of mutual accommodation that is necessary for the persistence of organisms. That the very same thing that governs the interactions between all the multitudinous flora in our guts and on our skins and in our mouths and the rest of the body. So there is this kind of cooperation that has to develop. It has to operate through this process of cognition and mutual accommodation and negotiation about what has to happen to help make sure that we all can survive as an assemblage. And something similar like that is happening in pregnancy as well. It is a new challenge, but it's the same kind of challenge that operates anytime our gut flora changes. The whole purpose of immune cells is to be polling the environment around themselves and inducing whatever modifications are needed to help this whole system persist.
Yeah, I thought about what if you eat a very narrow diet of all prepackaged foods versus you're like that guy from Bizarre Foods that goes all over the world and eats everything. I wondered about his gut microbiome. He must have, for a time, had the most varied gut microbiome you've ever seen in your life. He's eating everything.
Yes, probably, and it's pretty well established that our diet grows a particular assemblage of gut bacteria, and that we can not only train our gut bacteria, but our gut bacteria can train us as well. The composition of our gut ecosystems has some incredible ramifications for things like food preference and the regulation of body fat versus metabolism and those kinds of things. So it literally is a two-way street. And again, these are emerging things that are coming out of our increasing knowledge of how living things work and how they remember past experience and how they influence those memories of past experience.
But it's interesting to think that we can create, at least some degree of immunity by exposing ourselves, like you said, to dirt and maybe in low levels to toxins and to all kinds of different foods. And it's interesting that we can change maybe not what we consider to be us, our somatic cells, but our immune system, which is still us, or our gut bacteria, which some people think is us or not us. And we can change what they are and the composition and everything and really actively alter how we react to our environment by doing these things, such as eating different foods.
Well, there's no doubt that there's a lot of mutual negotiation and accommodation going on there. It's pretty well established that we can train our gut bacteria with our diet, and someone who eats a carbohydrate-rich diet is going to have a different gut flora from someone who eats a more protein-rich diet. So it does work that way as well, but it works. It also works the other way. Our gut bacteria have some amazing capabilities of being able to influence things like food preferences and regulation of how the body processes materials. That is, whether it lays down fat or whether it burns it up immediately to generate heat, and so it literally is a mutual accommodation between all these different organisms that together make up, really, in our case, what is essentially a superorganism, very similar in organization to the way the social insect colony, the termite colony, works.
Yeah. So what are some of the unique or deeper insights you've gotten from studying this and thinking about it for so many years?
I think it's given me a deeper appreciation of what adaptation is. Adaptation is really kind of a troubled concept in modern evolutionary biology. Many of my colleagues will object to the statement, but I don't think we really understand adaptation very well, and this, I think, has led us to having explanations for evolution that don't really hold water anymore. And so, for example, I for many years was a pretty staunch Darwinist, and as a consequence of trying to confront this issue in termite mounds, over many years, I've had to really rethink that commitment. I can't really claim to be a Darwinian anymore. I think the whole genetic selection idea, what's often called neo-Darwinism, doesn't really explain very much. I've become more of a Lamarckian, if your audience will appreciate that word. And as part of that, it's led me to a deeper exploration of just what life is and how that nature influences the evolution of life and adaptation. And I've come down to the conclusion that evolution is not really a matter of selection. It's actually a matter of cognition and striving. And one thing I say that often sets people's teeth on edge is that there's a certain degree of intentionality and purposefulness to evolution that the whole Darwinian idea tries to exclude, and it excludes that. One can say that there's good reasons for that. You want to be properly scientific. You don't want to be reading intentions into other organisms and so forth. I appreciate that stance quite a bit. But ultimately, life is a very purposeful phenomenon, and it has intentionality. It has creativity. Those are probably the most distinctive things about it. And I don't see how a theory of evolution that excludes those very things can really tell us very much. And so that's one of the reasons why I've sort of moved away from being a Darwinian to being more of a Lamarckian, because that's actually brings in to our thinking elements of cognition and intentionality and purposefulness that the Darwinian idea excludes from the outset, and we're still working out, what the implications of that are, but it's what this work has led me into.
Well, you can still go halfway and say you're an epigeneticist,
Well,
so you don't have to go all the way to Lamarckianism, being a Lamarckian and talking about intention and will and all that. You could just say, hey, we acquire epigenetic marks, or our genome adapts to the environment. There's no will or consciousness there, but even that to me is not satisfying. But I understand.
Well, I agree it's not satisfying, and that's one of the reasons why I am saying that no, you have to have a theory of evolution that takes into account life's unique properties, and epigenetics is certainly a part of this, but it's the whole story. It's not the whole story. When you ask yourself, okay, well, what is it that comes and feeds back to govern the existence of those genetic markers and so forth? You can understand quite a lot of what's going on by just focusing on epigenetics as a subdiscipline of genetics itself. So you can stay respectively within the fold of I'm putting this in scare quotes, scientific biology now, by focusing on that. But then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that's influencing those? And you ultimately come down to what's influencing those is the lived experience of the cells that contain that DNA. And if you just follow that thread, you're going to come ultimately to a physiological function, adaptation, the kind of purposeful behavior that governs life. And so I've tried my best to wiggle out of this dilemma, but ultimately you do have to come down to having to grapple with life's fundamental qualities, which is cognition, intentionality, and purposefulness.
Well, at what level does free will start? Are there different levels of it? At what level is there full consciousness, and what are the different levels of it? Does a dog have the same consciousness we have? Probably not. Does it have the same degree of free will that we have? I don't know. And then you go down maybe to a lower organism, a termite or an ant. Then you go down maybe to the cell or a bacteria. Has anyone attempt to quantify or give an idea of what they believe? Or I don't even know how you could observe this experimentally. I guess you'd have to figure it out. But has anyone made this hierarchy of free will, consciousness, etc.?
Well, this is one of the thorny issues here, isn't it? You mentioned that okay, I can accept that my dog is a conscious being, but certainly not in the same way that I am or you are. But ultimately, I can't even say that about you or any other human being, and that's in part because consciousness is just such an idiosyncratic thing. I know I am conscious to absolute certainty. I'm pretty sure you are 99.999%, but there is that little margin. Certainly, I can accept that. Certainly I can accept that my dog is conscious, but different, maybe 80% similar, and so forth. And so I've tried to stay away from issues of consciousness. I've actually preferred to express this in terms of cognition, which is the ability to sense an environment and to map that sense of the environment onto function, and then to couple that to modification of that sensed environment. And when you express it in this way, things become a little bit more tractable. They also are a bit more susceptible to scientific study. But one of the radical implications of this is that if cognition is life's distinctive property, then everything has to be cognitive in one way or another, and even bacteria and assemblages of bacteria are, in a sense, cognitive beings, and that thought has been percolating around biology for many years. One of the principal advocates of it for many years was Lynn Margulis, who, of course, was this amazing biologist who had these very heterodox thoughts about evolution. And one of the things one of the complaints that she had about the neo-Darwinian idea was that it didn't take into account that cognition was nearly a universal property of life, and that's something that I am really in agreement with. So these ideas are out there. It's a part of the debate. That's what makes it interesting, of course, and so it's percolating out there. It's an issue of interest to a lot of us.
I mean, even within people, think about your consciousness now versus if you ever got very drunk. You're kind of in a different state of consciousness, or if you smoked weed or took magic mushrooms, or if you're sleeping. I mean, there's all these, even within us, there's all these different levels and experiences of consciousness. You could say that someone that's sleeping is conscious, or they're unconscious really, but they're still aware, they're still dreaming, they're still doing something. I don't know, it's just, I understand it's very hard to quantify, but I think that some attempt needs to be made to quantify somehow. I know people have been doing it, trying it, but I don't know. I don't know where to lead. It's just thoughts I've had,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and when it comes to say drinking alcohol or taking drugs or those kinds of things, we perceive it consciously as a different conscious state, but of course, you can't get away from the notion that these are altered cognitive states as well, and addiction to different substances, alcohol or other kinds of drugs, is an interesting example of this, because we can delve into the ways that alcohol abuse, for example, modifies certain areas of the brain that are tied into pleasure and reward and those kinds of things. But ultimately, you come down to it. This is an altered cognitive state. Alcoholism and addiction; these are cognitive disorders. These are not disorders of the mechanism of pleasure and reward, you ultimately come down to the fact that an alcoholic or a drug abuser, somehow it seems to them like a good idea to drink an entire bottle of whiskey, or to stick the needle up your arm one more time.
Right.
Somehow that's thought by addicts to be the right thing to do, and that's really
not even addiction. I mean, when I was younger, I'd like to get drunk sometimes. I'm an alcoholic, but I remember when I was 21, I enjoyed getting drunk. It was fun, and you're in an altered state, but you kind of want that. It didn't feel bad at the time. Now it's forget it, but you people crave those things, which is odd. Or if someone takes mushrooms recreationally once or twice, that's this completely different state of existence. Who's to say, our normal state is good and that is bad? And the fact that you're able to even exist in this other altered state is interesting and strange, So it just makes you wonder, other beings, what's their experience? But, is there something that you could do to shut down part of the processing of your brain where you would experience life as a dog, let's say, for a short period of time? I don't know. It's just interesting to think about that.
It is an intriguing question. I have no idea how you could do that.
All right. Well, sorry to go off on that tangent, but any other really surprising insights, or what are the burning questions that you're working on right now that are most important to you that you want to solve or get some insight into?
The thing that has surprised me the most is how I've moved away from being a Darwinian. This is not something that I started out doing, or that I had a preconceived notion for doing. It was literally stumbling from one question to the other, and this is where I ended up. And looking back on it.
Well, if anyone ever bothers you about it, just say my perception randomly mutated one day, and now I think differently. Sorry.
Well, maybe there's a mutation at work. I don't know, but it's I like to think that I've done it consciously and intelligently. That's for other people to judge, of course. But that's the thing that has surprised me the most. Looking back on things that I did not expect to be intellectually where I am right now. The big challenge right now, though, is to try to put some of these ideas into some kind of scientific context, and so one of the things that I'm doing is that we've been moving away from termites lately. We still have active research going on there, but moving away from termites to looking at how other organisms, how adaptation actually works in other organisms, and so we've been doing some work in the Namib Desert. There's some just fascinating organisms there that adapt very well and live quite well in a very harsh environment, and so we've been looking into some of the mechanisms for that to see if we can see this kind of cognitively driven adaptation that has come out of our work with termites.
Well, very good. I know there's a lot more to talk about, but it's been a really good interview. So what's the best way for folks to find out more about your work and get in contact if they have questions and that kind of thing?
Well, they can go to my website. It's J. Scott Turner, all one word, and there's 3 T's in the middle of there, jscottturner.com. So my website is there, and there's contact information there as well. Anyone is welcome to send me correspondence by email. That's the email address is jsturner@syr.edu. I'm happy to hear from anyone who wants to chat with me.
That's great. Well, Scott, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, There's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.